They closed his eyes, not gently, not with ceremony, with routine. The hospital room in Deschapelles smelled of antiseptic and heat. April 1962. The air hung thick and unmoving, pressing against the walls of the Albert Schweitzer Hospital, as though even the wind had paused to listen. Clairvius Narcisse lay flat on a narrow metal bed. His chest did not rise, at least, not visibly. A nurse leaned close. A doctor checked again for pulse. Another listened for breath. Nothing, no movement, no response. The sheet was pulled over his face. Time of death, recorded, cause uncertain. His sister stood nearby, her hands trembling, but her face already settling into grief. In rural Haiti, death was not unfamiliar. It came quickly, often without explanation. But this was still her brother, still flesh that had worked beside her, still a voice that had argued and laughed and remembered childhood, hunger and mango seasons. Outside, the sun was merciless. Inside, he heard everything. That is where the story breaks open, because Clairvius Narcisse would later say he was not gone. He could not move, could not speak, could not force his lungs to obey, but he could hear. The doctor's voice, the scratch of pen on paper, the rustle of the sheet being drawn over his face. He felt hands lift him. He felt the shift of air as he was transferred. He wanted to scream. The body did not answer. Let me ask you something quietly. If your mind remains awake while your body refuses command, are you alive or already somewhere else? The hospital released him to his family. The death certificate was signed. There is documentation of this. Records from Albert Schweitzer Hospital confirm a man named Clairvius Narcisse was admitted on the 30th of April 1962 and pronounced dead shortly after. His body was returned to his village of L'Istoire for burial. Fact, stamped, filed. The village gathered. In Haiti, funerals do not unfold in silence. They unfold with presence, with community, with ritual. The coffin, simple wood, was prepared quickly. The climate did not allow delay. Inside that box, beneath folded hands, beneath a face arranged for rest, was a man who could still hear dirt being shoveled. He would later describe the sound, not thunderous, not dramatic, just steady, soft impacts, earth striking wood, again, 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 each one narrowing the world, air thinning, light erased. His heart still beating, faint, irregular, slowed by something he did not understand. Tetrodotoxin. The name would come years later, whispered by scientists trying to decode what Haitian folklore had long described differently. But in that moment, inside the coffin, there was no chemistry. There was only sound and darkness. He tried to move his fingers. Nothing. Tried to inhale deeply. The body answered in shallow, minimal rhythm. Time dissolved. He did not know how long he lay beneath soil before awareness fractured, whether oxygen ran thin, whether consciousness flickered and went out. Whether his body entered a state medicine still debates, but here is what history records with clarity. He was buried. He had been declared dead by licensed physicians. And 18 years later, he walked back into his village. Before we move forward, sit inside that hospital room a little longer. Clairvius had arrived complaining of fever, weakness, and strange pains. Witnesses described his condition deteriorating rapidly. Cyanosis, bluish skin, foaming at the mouth, loss of movement. Doctors examined him carefully. He was not dismissed casually. 3 physicians reportedly confirmed death. This was not a village healer, not rumor, a hospital. And yet something did not align. Let me ask you something again, this time not as a spectator, but as a thinking mind. How does a body mimic death convincingly enough to deceive trained doctors? And if it can, how many deaths in remote regions of the world were not truly deaths at all? The sheet covering his face, the heat pressing into the room, the scratch of pen, the coffin lid lowering. This is not folklore. This is documented record. What followed? That is where the story stretches between medicine and myth, because Haiti carries a word different from dead, zombie, not the Hollywood creature, not the rotting monster stumbling through apocalypse. In Haitian vodou tradition, a zombie is something else entirely. A person stripped of will, a body walking without self, a living death, but that meaning comes later. For now, we remain in 1962, in a coffin, in soil, with a man whose heartbeat had slowed to near invisibility. The burial completed, mourners returned home, life resumed its rhythm, his sister wept. The grave settled, and beneath that earth, whatever remained of Clairvius Narcisse entered silence. But silence is not always absence. Sometimes it is suspension. The village believed he was gone. The state believed he was gone. The hospital recorded him as gone. And yet 18 years later, a man would approach his sister in the marketplace, speak her childhood nickname, recount private memories only a brother would know, and say, "They buried me alive." Before we chase that moment, before we ask where he was for nearly 2 decades, we must sit with this one truth. He was declared dead by modern medicine. He was buried, and something inside that coffin did not surrender. The dirt fell, the world above continued. And somewhere beneath Haitian soil in 1962, a man hovered between breath and oblivion. What truly died in that coffin, and what was only waiting? No miracle split the wood. No hand burst upward through fresh earth. That would be easier to understand. Instead, what happened next unfolded in darkness. Clairvius would later say that after the dirt fell and the air thinned, something inside him gave way. Not surrender, but collapse, a slipping, a sinking deeper than sleep. He does not remember the moment oxygen ran out. He remembers sound fading. He remembers pressure in his chest. He remembers the sensation of falling inward. Then nothing. And then hands, rough hands, pulling, dragging, air flooding lungs like fire. He could not see clearly, could not control his limbs, but he sensed movement, voices. The scrape of tools striking wood, grave robbers, family. Number he would later insist it was neither. He would say men opened the coffin, men who had been waiting, men who knew exactly when to come. Let me slow this moment down, because this is where horror bends into possibility. In rural Haiti, burial happens quickly. The climate demands it. But graves are not always deep by Western standards, and nighttime activity near cemeteries is not unheard of, particularly in regions where vodou belief carries social weight. Clairvius described being removed from the coffin while still paralyzed, still conscious, still unable to speak. He said he felt the cool air of night against his skin, felt the weight of being carried. He could hear them. He could not protest. Now ask yourself something carefully. If you were fully aware but unable to move, and strangers lifted you from your grave, what would your mind do? Would it fracture? Would it retreat? Would it detach? The next phase of his account becomes darker. He described being given substances, powders, mixtures, placed into his mouth. He described prolonged confusion, disorientation, memory slipping in and out. He claimed he was transported far from his village, not to a city, not to a hospital, to a plantation. And here is where the word zombie begins to take its Haitian meaning. In Haitian folklore, a zombie is not undead in the Hollywood sense. A zombie is a person poisoned into a death-like state, buried, then revived and kept in a chemically induced stupor, stripped of will used for labor. a living body without agency, a slave without chains. Now pause, because this is not fantasy in Haitian cosmology, it is social fear. The fear of losing autonomy, the fear of being turned into a tool. Clairvius insisted that is what happened to him. He described waking intermittently, working in fields under watch, other figures near him, silent, slow-moving, vacant-eyed. He said he felt as though he were floating outside himself. Commands entered his ears. His body obeyed, but his self, the core of him, remained muffled. If this sounds unbelievable, understand this. The Haitian zombie myth is deeply tied to social punishment. In some interpretations, zombification was believed to be carried out by a bokor, a sorcerer, often at the request of someone seeking revenge or control, and in Clairvius Narcisse's case, he would later accuse someone close, but not yet. First, we must ask, could a toxin simulate death so convincingly that even trained doctors would be deceived? Years later, ethnobotanist Wade Davis would travel to Haiti and investigate this very question. His research pointed toward tetrodotoxin, a neurotoxin found in pufferfish, capable in certain doses of causing paralysis so complete that a person appears dead while remaining conscious. Heart rate slows, breathing nearly imperceptible, muscles frozen, but awareness intact. It is rare, dangerous, extremely difficult to dose accurately, but not impossible. Now understand the tension. If tetrodotoxin were used intentionally, it could produce precisely the state Narcisse described. But even if it explained the hospital death-like symptoms, it does not explain 18 years missing, 18 years absent from official record. 18 years in which a man declared dead was somewhere working, surviving, or wandering in fractured memory. Back in that grave, back in 1962, the coffin lid closed and the village believed closure had arrived. His sister mourned him. The hospital moved on. Life in Lest Sidra continued. Meanwhile, according to Narcisse, his body was being marched under moonlight. Let me ask you something. If someone can chemically steal your ability to move, and society believes you are dead, what protection do you have left? Because zombification, in its Haitian meaning, is not about resurrection. It is about erasure. Erasure of identity, erasure of legal existence, erasure of will. Clairvius would later describe the plantation as remote. He said he worked alongside others in similar states. He described a foreman figure overseeing them. He spoke of beatings, of exhaustion, mental fog so thick he could not track days. Years blurred. Time became indistinct. Eventually, he said, something changed. The man who controlled them died. Without that central authority administering whatever substances kept them subdued, clarity slowly returned. Memory resurfaced. His sense of self began rebuilding. And when that happened, he fled. If his account is true, then he was not resurrected. He was enslaved twice, first by burial, then by control. Now, let me ask you something directly. Which is more terrifying, being buried alive or being brought back without your will? The dirt falling in scene one was horror, but what followed might be something deeper, because if this story is even partially true, it suggests that death was not the end of Clairvius Narcisse. It was the beginning of something designed to make him disappear while still breathing. And the next time his sister saw him 18 years later, she would not see a ghost. She would see a man who carried the grave in his eyes. But before we reach that marketplace reunion, before we test recognition against disbelief, we have to cross those missing years. Where was he? Who took him? And why was he chosen? Voices bargaining over yams and plantains. Goats bleating somewhere near the edge of the road, the smell of fried plantain oil drifting in the heat, dust lifting with every passing footstep. Lesdie had not changed much in 18 years, but she had. Clairvius Narcisse's sister had aged into her grief. The sharp edge of mourning had long softened into something quieter, a space in her memory where her brother once stood. She believed she had buried him in 1962. She had watched them lower the coffin. She had heard the dirt fall. So when a thin man approached her in 1980, standing just close enough to enter her peripheral vision, she did not immediately look up. He spoke her childhood nickname, not the name used in public, not the one neighbors used, the one only family used. She froze. He did not rush. He did not touch her. He began naming details. A fight they had as children over stolen fruit, a mark on her leg from falling near the river, the layout of their old house before it was repaired. Private things, small things, things not recorded anywhere. Her breath shortened. She studied his face. The cheekbones were sharper, the body thinner, but there was something in the eyes. Not madness, not performance. Recognition. Let me ask you something. How many secrets must a stranger know before he is no longer a stranger? The village gathered quickly. Word spreads differently in small places. Clairvius, the name moved in whispers. Some backed away, some leaned closer, some crossed themselves. Because he had been buried, this was not rumor. There was a grave. There were witnesses. There was a death certificate, but here he stood alive, breathing, speaking, not stumbling like folklore's zombie, not vacant-eyed, clear, coherent. And that coherence changed everything. Local authorities were contacted, not because they believed in sorcery, because paperwork existed. The hospital in Deschapelles still had record of his death. The cemetery still held his grave. This was not an anonymous man claiming resurrection. This was a documented death walking upright. An investigation followed. His fingerprints were compared. His family testified to scars and identifying marks, a birthmark known only to relatives. Gradually, the conclusion formed. This was indeed Clairvius Narcisse, legally dead since 1962, now alive in 1980. But alive is not the correct word. Returned is closer. Let me pause here. Because this is the moment where skepticism rises. Could this have been fraud? Could another man have memorized details? Could grief have distorted recognition? These questions were asked, they must be. But the consistency of his knowledge, the family's confidence, and official documentation of his prior death made dismissal difficult. Clairvius did not come back seeking money. He did not demand attention. He did not perform theatrics. He worked quietly after his return, took small jobs, spoke reluctantly about the missing years. That restraint matters, because fraud often seeks spotlight. He avoided it when asked where he had been. He did not say heaven. He did not say limbo. He said plantation. He said drugged. He said controlled. He said his own brother had orchestrated it. Now the story shifts from supernatural to personal. Clairvius claimed that before his hospital admission in 1962, he had been involved in a land dispute with a sibling. He believed that sibling had sought the help of a bokor, a vodou sorcerer, to punish him. Zombification, in Haitian belief, can function as social sanction, as revenge, as control. If someone wanted you removed without visible murder, what better way than death without death? Let me ask you something uncomfortable. If a community believes zombification is possible, how powerful is that belief as a weapon, even if chemistry explains the paralysis, even if burial was temporary? The social power of belief makes the act devastating. Because once declared dead, you lose legal identity, you lose inheritance, you lose claim, you become erased. Clairvius insisted he had been erased intentionally, and the 18 years between burial and return were not empty. They were filled with labor, confusion, control. He described working in agricultural fields with others in similar states. He described a group of zombified laborers, overseen and subdued. He described partial awareness, like waking inside fog. The fog lifted slowly over years, and when it did, he fled, walked, returned home. 18 years after dirt struck wood. Now imagine standing in your village, the same sun overhead, the same dust underfoot, and everyone believes you died long ago. Who are you then? Are you reborn, or are you a reminder? Clairvius did not become a spectacle willingly, but journalists heard, researchers heard, anthropologists heard, and one man in particular, Wade Davis, a Harvard-trained ethnobotanist, traveled to Haiti in the 1980s to investigate. But before we move to laboratories and toxins, remain here in the marketplace, because this is the human center of the story, a sister confronted with resurrection, a village forced to reconcile paperwork with flesh, a man carrying 18 missing years in silence. Let me ask you something slowly. If you were buried, declared dead, mourned, forgotten by law, and then returned, would you want answers or would you want quiet? Clairvius chose quiet. He did not seek revenge publicly. He did not drag his brother into court. He did not demand compensation from hospital authorities. He simply lived. That detail unsettles the sensational narrative because it suggests sincerity, not performance. And yet, unanswered questions press forward. If tetrodotoxin explains the hospital paralysis, if grave robbing explains removal, if plantation labor explains missing years, who administered the powder, who knew when to dig, who benefited from his absence? Because zombification in Haitian context is rarely random, it is purposeful. And if purpose exists, motive follows. The marketplace reunion closed one chapter, but it opened something larger. Science would enter, skepticism would sharpen, media would distort, and the word zombie would travel far beyond Haiti's meaning. But here, in this dusty square in 1980, the mystery was not cinematic, it was intimate. A sister looking into her brother's face, a man standing where his grave still existed, and a question heavier than soil: what truly happened beneath that earth in 1962, because the body returned, but the truth was still buried. They did not call it a plantation the way Americans imagine one. There were no white columns, no ledger books displayed in open offices, no formal rows of cotton under a blazing southern sun, but it was labor, it was supervision, it was control. Clairvius described waking in fragments, not all at once. Not like a man stepping from darkness into light, more like someone surfacing from deep water, briefly, before being pulled under again. He said the first clear sensation after the grave was movement, being walked, not guided. Walked. His legs obeyed commands he did not consciously issue. His thoughts were slow, thick, like pushing through syrup. If this sounds theatrical, remember something crucial. Tetrodotoxin, the toxin later proposed by researchers, can produce paralysis without full loss of awareness. But when combined with other substances, datura, for example, known locally for causing delirium, prolonged confusion becomes plausible, not proven, not universally accepted, but biologically possible. Clairvius described being kept in a state where memory could not form cleanly, days blurred, faces blurred. Work did not. He said they harvested crops, cleared land, moved under supervision. He said there were others like him, men and women with empty stares, moving without expression, eating when told, sleeping where told. Not chained but not free. Now pause, because this is where Haitian belief diverges sharply from Western horror. A zombie in Haitian vodou tradition is not a cannibalistic monster. It is a person stripped of will, a living body without agency, a worker without choice. In other words, the ultimate symbol of enslavement. And that symbolism matters deeply in a nation born from a slave revolt. Haiti's revolution in the late 18th century shattered plantation slavery. It created the first black republic in the Western Hemisphere. The trauma and memory of slavery remained embedded in the Western cultural psyche. To be turned into a zombie is not to become undead, it is to be enslaved again. Clairvius insisted that is what happened to him. He said he recognized one of the men overseeing the labor. He said he understood, slowly, that this was punishment. And here the story narrows into something personal and sharp. He accused his own brother. A land dispute had simmered before his illness in 1962. Property in rural Haiti is not trivial. Land equals survival. Land equals inheritance. Land equals control. If he died, the land shifted. If he vanished, the land shifted. But if he remained legally dead, unable to contest, unable to testify, then the dispute resolved quietly. Let me ask you something difficult. If someone can make you disappear without killing you, is that not more efficient than murder? Because murder invites investigation, death invites mourning. But zombification, if believed possible, becomes socially terrifying in another way. It sends a message: step out of line, and you will not just die, you will lose yourself. Years passed. Clairvius described the fog lifting slowly after the man controlling the group died. He did not say exactly how, he did not dramatize it. He simply said that without that authority, the control weakened. Clarity returned in fragments, memories of his village, his sister, the grave. He began to understand he had been buried. He began to understand time had passed. He fled, not dramatically, quietly, walking back through rural Haiti until he found familiar terrain 18 years after the coffin. Now let us be careful. There is no documented proof of a specific plantation holding zombified laborers. No official police reports confirming such a facility. This part of the story relies heavily on Narcisse's own testimony, and testimony, especially after prolonged trauma, must be approached with both empathy and caution. Some skeptics argue that prolonged psychiatric episodes, identity disturbance, or misremembered trauma could account for portions of his account. Others argue that social coercion and toxic exposure, combined with cultural context, make his narrative disturbingly plausible. The truth may sit somewhere between, but what cannot be dismissed is this: he was declared dead by hospital physicians, he was buried, he reappeared 18 years later, and he carried a narrative consistent with Haitian zombification belief, long before Western media sensationalized it. Let me ask you something slowly. Why does the word zombie terrify Western audiences? Because it suggests loss of humanity, but in Haiti, the terror is different. It suggests loss of agency, loss of will, loss of legal existence. Clairvius was not wandering aimlessly when he returned. He spoke clearly, he remembered, he reclaimed his name, which suggests that whatever state he endured did not permanently erase him, it suppressed him. And suppression is not resurrection, it is captivity. The plantation he described was not cinematic horror. It was mundane horror, labor under control, movement without permission, existence without identity. Now consider the larger context. Haiti in the 1960s was under the rule of François Duvalier, Papa Doc, whose regime relied heavily on fear, secret police, and manipulation of vodou symbolism. Belief was weaponized politically. Authority understood the power of myth. If zombification could be framed as punishment, it became a tool, not necessarily widespread, not necessarily systematic, but socially potent. Clairvius's story sits precisely at the intersection of belief, chemistry, and power, which makes it dangerous because it refuses simple explanation. If tetrodotoxin mimicked death, if grave robbing extracted him, if drugs maintained compliance, then zombification becomes less myth and more method. But if those elements are incomplete, if memory blurred details, then the story still exposes something deeper. That fear of losing agency is universal. Clairvius Narcisse returned to his village, not as a monster, not as undead horror, but as a man who claimed he had been turned into labor after burial. And whether literal or symbolic, that claim struck at the core of Haitian history: slavery without chains, death without death, existence without self. And now, as researchers prepared to arrive and scientists prepared to test powders, the story was about to leave the village. Because once the world hears real zombie, it rarely listens for nuance, and nuance is exactly what this story demands. The man from Harvard did not come looking for horror. He came looking for chemistry. By the time Wade Davis arrived in Haiti in the early 1980s, Clairvius Narcisse's story had already begun traveling beyond Lestidre. Word of the dead man who returned reached anthropologists, journalists, and researchers who understood that beneath every legend sits either fabrication or something worth examining carefully. Davis was not the first outsider to hear of zombification, but he was among the first to ask a scientific question instead of a sensational one. If a person can be declared dead and later return alive, what biological mechanism makes that possible? He began where serious inquiry begins, with testimony. Clairvius repeated his account calmly: the hospital, the burial, the awakening, the plantation, the years in fog. No dramatic embellishment, no demand for fame, just consistency. Davis then turned toward Haitian Bokor, practitioners often described in Western shorthand as sorcerers, but in local context, complex spiritual figures operating within vodou tradition. Some Bokor claim to possess powders capable of inducing death-like states, not metaphorical death, physical paralysis, slow heartbeat, shallow respiration, the kind that might deceive even trained medical staff, particularly in a rural hospital in 1962 with limited diagnostic technology. And here enters tetrodotoxin, a neurotoxin found in pufferfish. In sufficient dose, it blocks sodium channels in nerve cells, preventing muscles from contracting. The result: complete paralysis. The mind can remain conscious. The body appears lifeless. Heart rate slows dramatically. Breathing becomes nearly undetectable. In extreme cases, victims appear dead. In modern hospitals with advanced monitoring, such paralysis might be detected. In 1962 Haiti, perhaps not. Davis collected samples of so-called zombie powder from practitioners. Laboratory analysis revealed traces of tetrodotoxin in some samples, not all, but enough to raise eyebrows. Let me ask you something carefully. If a toxin exists that can mimic death, if burial practices are rapid, if grave access is possible, is zombification suddenly myth or mechanism? The scientific community reacted cautiously. Some researchers supported Davis's findings as plausible. Others criticized his conclusions, arguing that tetrodotoxin concentrations were inconsistent and insufficient in certain samples. The debate became heated. because if zombification could be explained chemically, it would strip the word zombie of its supernatural aura, but confirm something arguably more disturbing, that a human being could be intentionally buried alive. Clairvius's hospital records showed no autopsy, no advanced cardiac monitoring, no brain activity scans. Physicians relied on pulse, breath, and observation. Under certain toxic conditions, those signs could vanish almost entirely. Imagine being a doctor in 1962. You check for pulse. None felt. You listen for breath. None heard. The skin is cold, the body unresponsive. You sign the certificate. Let me ask you something. How certain must you be before you declare someone dead? The more Davis investigated, the more the story refused to stay simple. Tetrodotoxin alone could explain the initial paralysis, but it could not explain 18 years of compliant labor. For that, another layer was necessary. Some researchers proposed the use of datura, a plant known for inducing delirium, hallucination, and confusion. In combination with tetrodotoxin, it could theoretically produce initial death like paralysis, followed by prolonged cognitive impairment, memory fragmentation, suggestibility, loss of self. Now pause, because even if chemically possible, administering such compounds precisely is extraordinarily difficult. Too little, the victim survives intact. Too much, the victim dies permanently. Which means, if zombification were real in Narcisse's case, whoever administered it possessed knowledge, both pharmacological and experiential. And here, culture re-enters the room. In Haiti, vodou is not dark sorcery. It is religion, community structure, spiritual identity. But within that structure exist figures, bokor, who operate outside benevolent priesthood. They are often associated with sorcery, punishment, and power. During the Duvalier regime, vodou symbolism was politically weaponized. Papa Doc positioned himself as mystical authority. Fear was cultivated. In such an environment, belief becomes tool. If communities believe zombification is possible, social control strengthens. Clairvius accused his brother of hiring a bokor. Land dispute, personal motive. No courtroom trial followed. No formal charges. His accusation remained part of oral testimony. And here is where moral tension sharpens. If zombification was used as punishment, it reflects internal exploitation within oppressed communities. If it was fabricated memory, it reflects trauma and fractured identity. If it was chemical assault, it reflects sophisticated cruelty. Which explanation unsettles you more? Because science can test toxins, but it cannot fully test memory. And memory under trauma is both resilient and unreliable. Davis's work culminated in books that popularized the idea of scientific zombification. Western media amplified it. Real zombie, buried alive. Headlines traveled faster than nuance. Clairvius Narcisse became case study specimen proof, or to skeptics, anomaly. But in Haiti, the word zombie never meant walking corpse. It meant something subtler, a person whose soul had been captured, a body working without will. And when you strip away sensationalism, ask yourself this: is that metaphor entirely foreign to the human experience? How many societies create living bodies without agency? How many systems bury people socially while they still breathe? Clairvius's story moved from village to laboratory, from cemetery to academic journal, from Haitian folklore to Western debate. But the heart of it remained buried in that coffin in 1962, a man paralyzed, conscious, declared dead. And if tetrodotoxin explains the first hours, it does not close the story. because even if chemistry mimicked death, something else kept him erased for 18 years. And that something sits beyond laboratory glass. The investigation had only deepened the mystery, not solved it, because now the question was no longer, did he die? It was, who decided he should? Haiti in the 1960s did not run on chemistry alone, it ran on fear. François Duvalier, Papa Doc, ruled the country with something sharper than rifles. He ruled with myth, with ritual, with the careful blending of politics and vodou symbolism. He dressed like Baron Samedi, the spirit of the dead in Haitian cosmology. He cultivated the image deliberately. When power dresses itself in the language of spirits, belief becomes governance. The Tonton Macoute, his paramilitary force, did not rely only on guns. They relied on reputation, on whispers, on the idea that resistance could result not just in death, but disappearance. Now, step into that atmosphere, a rural land dispute, a brother accusing a brother, a boker rumored to possess powders that could send a man into death like paralysis, a hospital pronouncing him dead, a burial, and then silence. Clairvius Narcisse returned 18 years later and accused his own sibling of arranging his zombification. He did not shout it from rooftops. He did not drag the accusation into national scandal, but he spoke it plainly to investigators. There had been conflict over land. He believed a dispute had escalated. He believed someone wanted him removed without blood. Let me ask you something. In a society where death certificates transfer property, what is more efficient than a death that leaves no murderer? If he had been killed outright, suspicion might have followed. But buried officially, mourned publicly, declared dead by hospital authority, the matter closes cleanly unless the dead walk back. This is where the bokor enters the story more sharply. In Haitian belief, a bokor differs from a hangan or mambo vodou priest or priestess. A bokor is often described as someone who works in both light and dark, capable of healing or harming, depending on intent and request. To hire a bokor for zombification, according to folklore, is to request social annihilation. You do not kill your enemy, you empty them. You turn them into labor. You reduce them to body without will. Clairvius insisted that is what happened to him. But understand something critical. There is no documented court conviction proving a bokor was involved in his case. No legal confirmation that his brother orchestrated it. His accusation remains part of his testimony. And testimony, especially in contexts of trauma and prolonged chemical exposure, must be handled carefully. Some skeptics argue that his memories of plantation labor could reflect disorientation during recovery from poisoning. Others argue that, in Duvalier-era Haiti, remote labor exploitation would not have been difficult to conceal. Which explanation feels heavier? Because if zombification was real in his case, it was not supernatural horror, it was social control. During Papa Doc's rule, thousands disappeared, some imprisoned, some executed, some silenced. Belief in zombification served political function. If people believe they can be turned into mindless laborers rather than simply killed, fear deepens. It becomes intimate. Let me ask you something quietly. What frightens you more, death or living without yourself? Clairvius described working among others who seemed vacant. He described a man overseeing them. He described regaining clarity only after that overseer died. That detail is important. If drugs were administered regularly to maintain mental fog, removal of the administrator could plausibly allow recovery. But even that explanation raises further question. How many others were there? Why no mass testimonies? Why no additional confirmed cases from that exact plantation? Here is where historical integrity requires honesty. Clairvius Narcisse remains the only thoroughly documented case of this kind, with hospital records verifying prior death declaration. There are stories of other zombies in Haitian folklore, but none carry the same paper trail, and that isolation intensifies both intrigue and skepticism. Was he unique? Was he extraordinarily unlucky or extraordinarily targeted? The accusation against his brother introduces moral complexity. Family betrayal is quieter than political oppression. Land disputes fracture villages more often than dictators. If true, his zombification would not represent regime-wide conspiracy. It would represent intimate cruelty. That possibility shifts the story from myth to human darkness, because betrayal from within wounds differently than violence from above. Clairvius did not seek revenge publicly. He did not pursue legal battle. He resumed life, worked modest jobs, spoke sparingly, which complicates the narrative further. Fraud seeks attention. Trauma often avoids it. Let me ask you something carefully. If you had lost 18 years of your life, would you chase headlines, or would you rebuild quietly? Clairvius chose quiet, and that quiet unsettles sensational narratives more than dramatic proclamations would, because it suggests authenticity, but authenticity does not eliminate ambiguity. The Bokor, if involved, left no signed confession. The brother, if responsible, was never tried in court for attempted murder via zombification. The Duvalier regime, though manipulative, did not formally acknowledge such cases, and so we stand in tension between toxin and testimony, between folklore and pharmacology, between family conflict and cultural belief. The word zombie, in Western imagination, conjures apocalypse. In Haitian reality, it conjures exploitation, loss of autonomy. Social death. Clairvius Narcisse may not have been undead, but he was socially erased, legally dead, property transferred, identity voided. And if someone orchestrated that erasure intentionally, it represents a chilling efficiency, not murder, not disappearance. Erasure with paperwork intact. The Bokor, whether mythic or literal in his case, becomes symbol of power wielded quietly, and power, when invisible, is hardest to fight. Clairvius returned, but many who disappear never do. That is the deeper unease beneath his story, because if zombification exists as mechanism, chemical or psychological, it reveals something universal. Human beings fear losing agency more than losing breath, and in Haiti's turbulent history, that fear was never abstract. The coffin closed in 1962, the grave settled, but the forces that might have placed him there were not supernatural. They were human, and human power, when wrapped in belief, becomes difficult to untangle. Which brings us to something heavier still. After returning from death, chemically, socially, or symbolically, how do you live? Because survival is not restoration, and resurrection is not repair. Clairvius Narcisse walked back into his village, but the grave did not release him entirely. Not yet. When a man is declared dead by law, the world rearranges itself around that absence. Land transfers. Inheritance shifts, records close. Mourning ends. Clairvius Narcisse returned to Les Chidres in 1980, but he did not return to the same place he had left in 1962. The grave still existed. The death certificate still bore his name. The community had adjusted to his absence, and now he stood in the marketplace, alive in flesh, but officially erased. What does a man do with 18 missing years? He did not hold public gatherings to recount horror. He did not lean into spectacle. He did not become a professional mystic. He worked quietly. Agricultural labor, Small jobs, modest routines. There is something grounding about that detail, because it moves the story away from myth and back into human rhythm. He resumed eating in familiar kitchens, walking familiar roads, seeing faces that had aged while he had been absent, but he did not resume youth. Those 18 years were not waiting for him. They were gone. Let me ask you something. If you wake from a grave and the world has already grieved you, who are you now? His sister accepted him, the family accepted him. But acceptance does not erase shock. There is an adjustment that must happen when someone returns from legal death. He had to prove himself not theatrically, but through memory, through scars, through knowledge of private things, and once recognized, he still carried the weight of explanation. Journalists arrived, researchers asked questions, outsiders with notebooks and cameras. He answered sparingly, repeated the hospital, the coffin, the plantation, the fog, the escape. He did not change the story dramatically across retellings. Consistency does not equal truth, but inconsistency invites suspicion. Is steadiness complicated, easy dismissal? And yet, imagine the interior. Imagine sleeping at night after knowing what soil sounds like from the inside of a coffin. Imagine feeling dirt hit wood in your dreams. Even if science explains paralysis, even if tetrodotoxin explains slow pulse, that does not erase the psychological rupture. Being buried alive, even briefly, would carve itself into the nervous system, add years of disorientation and possible forced labor. What does that do to a mind? He did not publicly display madness. He did not rant, but trauma does not always shout. Sometimes it becomes silence. Sometimes it becomes restraint. Sometimes it becomes a man who avoids crowds and prefers routine. Let me ask you something honestly. Is survival always heroic? Or is it sometimes simply quiet endurance? Clairvius's later life does not read like horror cinema. It reads like a man trying to stabilize himself in a world that once erased him. He lived into his 70s. He died in 1994. No dramatic disappearance, no second burial controversy. His life closed as any other villager's might, but his legal status remains extraordinary. He was a man who had an official death certificate dated 1962 and who walked around for more than a decade afterward. That contradiction sits in archives, in hospital records, in anthropological studies, and it forces medicine to confront humility, because medicine does not like uncertainty. Yet here stands a case where 3 physicians declared death and were wrong. If tetrodotoxin explains the paralysis, it suggests that diagnostic limitations can turn the living into the dead. And that possibility carries implications beyond Haiti. How many people throughout history were declared dead prematurely in regions without advanced monitoring? In eras before modern cardiology, the line between life and death has never been as sharp as we imagine. Clairvius lived in that line, suspended between categories not fully believed, not fully dismissed. The media eventually simplified him into real zombie. Hollywood borrowed the word long before, but his story reinforced the fascination. Western audiences consumed it as proof of exotic mystery, but that framing misses the deeper tension, because in Haitian context, zombification is not spectacle, it is caution, it is warning, it is social boundary, it is a metaphor for exploitation. Clairvius did not look like a movie monster. He looked like a man who had endured something unclassifiable. Let me ask you something slowly. If you survived burial and enslavement, would you want to be remembered as a curiosity or as a warning? Clairvius Narcisse did not control how the world framed him. Researchers debated him, skeptics challenged him, believers defended him. But he did not build identity around the label. He lived. That might be the most unsettling detail of all, because it suggests that whatever happened in 1962 was not staged. It was survived, and survival leaves marks. Not always visible, not always dramatic, but present. When he walked through his village in the late 1980s, people no longer gasped. The shock had softened into familiarity. He was once again part of the rhythm of daily life. But the grave still existed. Somewhere in that cemetery lay a plot bearing his name, a physical space that once contained him. And that physical contradiction remains one of the most haunting images of this story, a man walking through his village while his grave sits behind a churchyard wall. Two versions of him. One buried, one breathing. Which one is more real? That question lingers beyond his death in 1994. Because this is not simply a story about poison or vodou, or skepticism versus belief. It is a story about identity, about how fragile the boundary between life and death can be, about how easily systems can erase a person, and about how difficult it is to fully restore someone once erased. Clairvius Narcisse lived quietly after returning. But quiet does not mean insignificant. His existence forces a question medicine cannot comfortably answer. When do we truly know someone is gone? And what happens when we are wrong? The grave never disappeared. Even after he walked again, even after researchers flew in and out of Haiti with samples and theories, even after newspapers stamped the phrase, "real zombie" across headlines, the grave remained, a rectangular patch of earth that once held a man who would later stand upright in the same sunlight. That image refuses to soften, because it exposes something fragile in all of us, the thinness of the line we draw between the living and the dead. Clairvius Narcisse died in 1994. This time there was no return, no marketplace reunion, no sister frozen in disbelief, no anthropologist collecting powders. His death passed quietly, but his story did not. It lingered in academic debate, in Haitian folklore, in documentaries, in skeptical essays, in spiritual conversations, and it still lingers now. Let me slow the rhythm for a moment, because by this point the shock has settled. The burial is no longer fresh, the fog years have been spoken, the laboratory explanations offered, the political climate examined. Now we sit with something more difficult, meaning. What does this story mean? Not in sensational terms, not in horror film shorthand, but in human terms. If tetrodotoxin can mimic death, then medicine must remain humble. If burial practices can mistake paralysis for death, then certainty must be questioned. If belief systems can weaponize fear, then culture must be understood, not mocked. And if a man can lose 18 years of his life and return quietly, then survival is more complex than heroism. Clairvius Narcisse forces us to confront layered realities. One layer is chemical, a toxin capable of halting visible life signs. Another layer is cultural, a society where zombification represents ultimate social punishment. Another layer is political, a regime that cultivated fear and mysticism as instruments of control. And beneath all of that, a brother accusing a brother, a land dispute, a private conflict that may have triggered public horror. Let me ask you something quietly. Which layer unsettles you most? The idea of poison mimicking death, the possibility of family betrayal, or the realization that legal death does not always equal biological death? Western media often reduced his story to spectacle, but Haiti never needed spectacle, it needed context. The zombie in Haitian belief is not a flesh-eating corpse. It is a person stripped of agency, a body walking without will, a metaphor born from the trauma of slavery. In a country forged by rebellion against enslavement, the deepest fear is not death. It is losing control of your own body. Clairvius's story lies precisely at that intersection. Whether chemically induced or psychologically layered, he experienced erasure, declared dead, buried, removed, used, forgotten, then returned. If even part of his testimony holds truth, then zombification in his case was not supernatural horror, it was human manipulation. And that is more unsettling than any myth, because it suggests capability, intent, method. Let me ask you something directly. If science eventually proves every detail of his story plausible, does that comfort you, or does it disturb you more? Because a myth can be dismissed, a mechanism cannot. Clairvius Narcisse never claimed to be immortal. He never claimed to defy nature. He claimed something simpler and more disturbing. He was made to appear dead. He was buried. He was controlled, and he returned. The skepticism around his case remains healthy. It must extraordinary claims require examination, but dismissal without examination is arrogance. His hospital records exist. His death certificate exists. His reappearance was documented. The debates around tetrodotoxin remain unresolved in full. The plantation he described was never conclusively identified, and perhaps that uncertainty is fitting, because this story refuses to settle into clean boxes. It resists being pinned down. It exists between belief and biology, between myth and medicine, between memory and documentation. Now return with me to the opening image, a coffin lowering into Haitian soil, dirt striking wood, a sister grieving, doctors signing paperwork, the world closing a chapter, only to discover 18 years later that the chapter had never truly ended. But here is the difference now. When that coffin closed in 1962, we saw it as final. When he died in 1994, we understand something we did not before. Death is not always what we think it is, and life is not always guaranteed by breath alone. Clairvius Narcisse does not fit neatly into supernatural folklore. He does not sit comfortably inside scientific certainty. He lives in the space between, and maybe that is why his story refuses to fade, because it confronts us with a question we rarely sit with long enough: how fragile is our definition of being alive? If you were buried today, declared gone, mourned and processed, and then somehow stood up again, would the world make space for you? Or would it call you impossible? Clairvius walked through his village carrying proof that something went wrong in 1962. Whether toxin, belief, betrayal, or all three intertwined, something failed, something misjudged, something manipulated, and he survived it. That survival does not offer comfort. It offers tension, because it means the line between life and death, agency and control, belief and science is thinner than we prefer. The grave remains the final image, not because it trapped him forever, but because it reminds us that certainty can bury truth just as easily as soil can bury a man, and sometimes truth walks back out. In the cemetery at Enslaved, the earth does not announce what it once held. Graves settle, grass grows, names fade under rain and sun. If you walked there today without knowing the story, nothing would seem unusual. A modest rural burial ground, concrete markers, simple crosses, and somewhere among them, a space that once held a man who later walked back into daylight. That is where we end. Not in a laboratory, not in a courtroom, not in a horror scene, but in stillness, because Clairvius Narcisse's story does not resolve cleanly. It lingers. Let us pull every thread together carefully. In 1962, a man falls ill in Haiti. Doctors in Deschapelles examine him. They find no detectable pulse. no measurable respiration. He is declared dead. A death certificate is signed. He is buried. 18 years later, he reappears, recognized by family, verified by records. He claims he was poisoned into paralysis, buried alive, removed from his grave, drugged further, forced into labor. He accuses a brother in a land dispute. Researchers test powders. Tetrodotoxin is identified as plausible agent. Skeptics challenge dosage levels. Debate unfolds. He lives quietly. He dies in 1994. That is the documented arc. But beneath documentation sits something deeper. The word zombie entered Western imagination as fantasy. In Haitian reality, it emerged from history, from slavery, from loss of autonomy, from fear of being turned into a tool. A zombie is not a corpse craving flesh. A zombie is a person robbed of will, and when you understand that, Clairvius's story changes. Because whether chemical, cultural, or conspiratorial, his experience reflects a universal fear, losing control over your own body. Let me ask you something now, not for shock, not for drama, but for reflection. In modern society, how often are people declared something they are not? Unfit, gone, finished, erased. How often does paperwork override lived reality? How often does authority define existence? Clairvius Narcisse forces medicine to confront fallibility. He forces science to admit gray space. He forces cultural outsiders to respect belief systems rather than mock them. And he forces us to confront how easily identity can be stripped, because even if you reject zombification entirely, the medical error remains. He was declared dead and was not. That alone is profound, and if even part of his account of exploitation holds truth, then the horror is not mystical. It is human beings with motive, human beings with knowledge. Human beings capable of turning belief into weapon. Now return to that coffin one final time. The lid closing, the soil striking wood, the sister grieving. Imagine the darkness inside, the stillness, the body that appears lifeless. Then imagine beneath that silence awareness. That is where this story lives. In the possibility that certainty can be wrong, Clairvius Narcisse does not need embellishment. He does not need cinematic thunder. His power lies in contradiction, dead, but not dead, buried, but breathing, erased, but returning. Let me ask you something gently. If you were in that hospital room in 1962, would you have declared him dead? If you were in that village in 1980, would you have believed him? And if you were him, carrying 18 missing years, would you have spoken at all? He spoke just enough, and perhaps that is why the story still unsettles, because it never explodes into spectacle, it settles into doubt, and doubt is harder to dismiss than myth. When he died in 1994, no headlines screamed resurrection, no second miracle followed. The grave closed again, this time permanently. But the tension remains, because somewhere in archives there exists a death certificate dated 1962 for a man who lived decades beyond it. Somewhere in Haitian oral tradition, the warning about zombification continues. And somewhere in medicine, humility whispers, be careful before you declare finality. Clairvius Narcisse's life sits between worlds, between folklore and pharmacology, between skepticism and belief, between death and return, and that space between is where the most unsettling truths often reside. If this story stayed with you, sit with it a little longer, not because it proves zombies are real, but because it proves something more enduring. The line between life and death is thinner than we like to admit. And sometimes what we bury does not stay buried, not myth, not memory, not truth.